A castle-like building saved from destruction by a remarkable Hollywood connection.
The same day that the wrecking balls came to tear this place down was the same day that the filming company showed up.
Vast monolithic structures that dominate a tiny island with a dark past.
What are these things doing in this otherwise pristine landscape?
A mysterious island on the edge of the Baltic Sea, where strange things happen.
All the structures that exist are riddled with bullet holes and signs of explosions. It's like you're walking through a war zone.
Weird, battered constructions in a dangerous place on the coast of England.
Pretty well all the work that was carried out here was secret, ultimately top secret.
Once they were some of the most advanced structures on the planet, at the cutting edge of design and construction. Today, they stand abandoned, contaminated, and sometimes deadly. But who built them, and how? And why were they abandoned? In the middle of the state of Ohio in the USA, just to the north of the city of Mansfield, stands an ornate, impressive building.
From the outside, it looks like some kind of palace or even a castle. It appears to be the kind of structure that you would create that would have a lasting impression on anyone who set eyes on it.
When you see this building, you know it was built for something important. And clearly, whoever built it meant it to last.
The building is vast and grand, with very detailed and fancy architecture. It's definitely a statement piece.
It's built with this massive, massive stone, so clearly it's not a very inviting place.
It kind of gives you the shivers. It's sort of like a haunted house, and it definitely gives you the impression that something bad may have happened here.
Yet its forbidding appearance is the only real clue about what actually went on inside the building. That is a dark, brutal, and controversial story.
What it originally set out to do and what it ended up, those bookends couldn't be further apart.
This was to be a place of spiritual regeneration and rebirth. It's about salvation. This is a righteous building.
And you have to imagine that those who conceived it had no idea what a horror story of a legacy they had spawned.
So, why go to such lengths to build such a dramatic-looking structure? What was it used for? And why was it abandoned? The origin of the building's story stretched back as far as the late 19th century. It was built in the mid-1880s, and it was intended to be a beacon of hope for the state.
This site at Mansfield was chosen in 1885 for a very special reason and a very particular project. It was one that was going to be liberal and progressive. They wanted to take young offenders and rehabilitate and re-educate them in the most positive way possible.
It was a reformatory. So the notion was you weren't just punishing people, you were helping them learn, and then you would release them out in the world and they would commit crimes no more.
This is the Ohio State Reformatory. Although construction began in 1886, it wasn't until September 1896 that the first 150 young offenders were brought here to begin their rehabilitation.
They started housing prisoners in the complex before it was even finished. And the prisoners themselves did a lot of the work to complete the building, including building the sewer system.
Funding delays meant that the reformatory was not finally completed until 1910. While the facility at first had a progressive agenda, the reformist zeal was soon replaced by a more brutal approach to life inside.
The place had taken a completely different direction. This was now a place not of rehabilitation, but a place of incarceration, where you lock up the baddies and throw away the key.
This wing is proof of the very different direction the reformatory eventually took, as expert Ron Puff explains.
We're currently in the West Cell Block. The West Cell Block was a housing unit for your inmates. This has 5 tiers, originally 350 cells, meant for 1 inmate to a cell. Ended up from the very beginning with 2 inmates, so we house 700 inmates here. It wasn't so bad early on living here. Now, in later years, they could be in their cells 20, 22 hours a day.
Can you imagine being there, walking through those corridors into your cage cell and hearing the sound of the door slammed and locked behind you? And then the riotous sounds of other inmates. It must have been a terrifying existence.
But the rising crime rate meant that more and more prisoners were arriving at the Ohio State Reformatory. Soon, juvenile inmates were being kept apart from adult prisoners. The prison's aims and purpose were changing fast. So fast, the juveniles were forced to leave.
So they keep this as an adult facility, and all those juveniles have to go to another facility altogether, and now you've got a prison full of space. What do you do with it?
In wider society, ever more people were being convicted of increasingly violent crimes, and prisons across the country were becoming overfilled with inmates. So Mansfield became just another prison. In fact, it became one of the hardest prisons, the worst of the worst, with some of the most violent offenders from around the country being kept there.
Ohio State Reformatory certainly had its share of notorious inmates. One was the infamous George Bugs Moran, who was part of the John Dillinger crime gang. Others included William Sidney Porter, better known as O. Henry, the short story writer, and Sam Shepard, whose conviction in 1954 for murdering his wife attracted national media coverage. As inmate numbers continued to rise, life in the prison became even more harsh and fraught with danger. Living day to day was a perilous business as prison discipline broke down. Ohio State eventually became a maximum security facility.
Violence was part of everyday life. You could be beat up in a fight, you could be stabbed, you could be mugged, you could be thrown off a high walkway. I mean, the place was such that you were in fear of your life each and every day.
Inmates were told, when you came here, make yourself a weapon and hide it in the backyard, so if everything goes crazy, you at least know where your shank or your rock or whatever it is you placed is, so you can be safe. And they feared coming in the gates here.
One of the most frightening places in which to find yourself was at the end of these dark corridors. It was somewhere no one wanted to be.
For the worst offenders, there was solitary confinement here at the reformatory. When you came in here, it was punishment. And so the whole time you were in here, you weren't supposed to talk. They might keep the lights on 24 hours a day. They might keep the lights off 24 hours a day. There was no reading. Your meal schedule would be moved around, so you never knew what time it was. And so early on, they came in here with no clothes. They were naked. They had a bucket. That was their commode. They slept on the cement floor.
In a crowded prison blighted by almost daily violence and rioting, it was no surprise that the Hole, as it was known, was always crammed with inmates.
In one case, they had a riot, and they wound up putting 120 prisoners down in the hole at the same time for 30 days.
In this instance, they actually found a body that had been murdered and stuffed into a mattress for several days before anyone realized he was dead.
The terrible violence continued until the inmates themselves finally took action.
Inmates finally took matters into their own hands, and they filed a lawsuit that the facility was violating their constitutional rights by dehumanizing them. In the end, the problems at the site were so widespread that it was all too much, and the facility was abandoned.
That was in 1990. During its 96-year history, some 150,000 inmates had walked through Ohio State Reformatory's doors. More than 200 of them had died while they were inside.
These days, there are many accounts of it being haunted, of there being paranormal activity at the site. But that's hardly surprising when you think of the degree of violence that the building had seen for so many decades.
Is the Ohio State Reformatory haunted? And if you ask a number of our staff members, they will say yes. They'll snap their finger just like that. Me? Things happen here. Why? I'll let you figure it out.
Today, this grand facility has become a major tourist attraction, thanks in no small part to a strange twist of fate.
It was scheduled for demolition, but just before that, a film crew came to shoot a movie that, of course, has become world famous, The Shawshank Redemption.
The same day that the wrecking balls came to tear this place down was the same day that the filming company showed up.
The Shawshank Redemption was the redemption of this prison.
Just off the coast of Normandy in France is the small island of Guernsey. Along its coastline are bizarre-looking constructions.
In the otherwise quiet and picturesque surroundings, you start to discover actually a huge amount of these concrete, imposing structures.
The way that these concrete monoliths are stepped, they look a bit like the heads off of Easter Island.
It's like Star Wars has been filmed there. These really strange, almost monolithic type constructions poking out of the ground.
Further inland, a cavernous concrete bowl lies sunken into the ground.
It's huge. It's like an amphitheatre. I don't think the locals would have ever envisaged structures like this being built on the islands.
Beneath this great mass of concrete lurk other hidden features.
There's a railway track that starts to lead you into a tunnel. And when you follow that tunnel inside, you start going underground.
When you get closer, you see that there's actually a lot more to them. There's networks, and you start to kind of see old paraphernalia.
In the maze of dark rooms, mysterious symbols and writings can still be seen. But the words are not in English, they are written in German. And these are the first hints at the terrible fate that befell those who once occupied the rooms.
Things started to get really tough.
In fact, many of them began to starve.
Who was it that built these gigantic structures? And why were they finally abandoned? The roots of the mystery can be found in the early years of World War II. By June 1940, Hitler's forces had defeated France and were turning their attention to their next target, Great Britain. A mere 20 miles away across the English Channel, the prize was tantalizingly close. But a small piece of British territory lay even closer, the Channel Islands.
Although the Channel Islands are British territory, they're actually much closer to the coast of France, and Hitler viewed them as strategically important.
If you want to go from Britain and invade France, the Channel Islands are a great first step. They get you most of the way there, and the Nazis could not allow the British to continue to control those islands right on the edge of France.
On the 28th of June 1940, Luftwaffe bombers came swooping in over the islands.
The tragedy within the war was the fact that the Germans essentially bombed the Channel Islands, expecting there to be quite a lot of resistance. They killed about 44 people, and they didn't need to do that.
It was only a few days later when the Germans actually arrived, they discovered that the islands had been undefended the whole time.
In 1940, Britain was standing alone against the power of the Third Reich. And Churchill was not sure he could defend the island of Great Britain, never mind Guernsey, Jersey, Sark, and Alderney.
As the German army stormed through France during the summer of 1940, about a third of Channel Islanders, some 30,000 people, were evacuated. The rest chose to remain, preferring to take their chances when the inevitable invasion came. In late June, the German flag was raised on Guernsey. On July 1st, Jersey surrendered. The German order for islanders to fly white flags over their houses was just a small taste of what was to come. While Churchill decided to leave the islands undefended, Hitler had other ideas. He desperately wanted them fortified with the most impressive defenses the Third Reich could create. Here on Guernsey, this was part of the plan. The mighty MP3 Tower. Local expert and preservationist Paul Borghese explains how the tower fitted into the Nazi plans.
It was basically a range-finding tower. It was one of 5, and each level had range-finding capabilities to obviously find and observe targets and send the data back to the gun batteries inland.
The Germans spent over a year building their extensive network of defenses on Guernsey. Located a few miles inland from the MP3 range tower, this immense concrete bowl was to be one of its most important features. But what was it to be used for? There's a clue in the rail tracks that snake underground.
This little railway track was used to bring the ammunition from the storage bunkers, and they would be stored in this large room here, and these would be loaded through this flash-proof hatch and then stored in that room.
More than 61,000 cubic yards of concrete were used to build the bunker systems that contain troop quarters, ammunition storage, and electrical generators. All constructed to withstand concerted, sustained firepower. Deep in the darkness, the slogans on the walls provide chilling proof of the German army's intentions and of its supreme confidence.
You can see one side we've got a large German eagle painted on the wall. And over on this side, the emblem of the naval engineers. There was a cog, and we're marching towards England. That was the motto.
Wir fahren nach England. We are going to England. The Germans intended to invade England. Why would they be painting that on a bunker?
The Germans' great confidence may have been helped by what was housed in the huge concrete bowl. Formidable guns in a bunker complex that was called Battery Mirus.
It consisted of 4 gun emplacements with huge, great big guns disguised as houses. You can start to imagine the size and the scale of these guns.
Here we are. We can see one of the 4 huge emplacements for the 30.5 centimetre gun mounted there on that central position where those studs are sticking up. Underneath the mount was a naval depth charge, and that could have been detonated in the event that the emplacement was captured and blow the gun off its mountings.
With a range of over 30 miles, the 4 guns were able to protect the Channel Islands and reach almost all the way to the Normandy coast. The German firepower on Guernsey was extraordinary. In total, 17 coastal artillery batteries and 175 anti-aircraft guns were placed on the island. But all of this came at a huge cost in resources.
This was part of the Atlantic Wall, which stretched all the way from Norway down to Spain. And it's estimated that some 8% of all of the concrete along all of those constructions was just housed in the Channel Islands.
In fact, they fortified the Channel Islands so much that there were more guns installed here than there were on the neighbouring 600 miles of Normandy coastline.
German officers who were skeptical about the strategic and operational value of the Channel Islands refer to the dense, resource-intensive fortifications as Hitler's island madness.
With so much effort, time and resources committed to building it, and with its frequent appearance in German propaganda, what finally became of Battery Mirus? The beginning of the end came on June 6, 1944. The famous date of the Allied invasion of France.
After the D-Day landings, the German soldiers based in the Channel Islands became cut off and had no access to supplies. There were Red Cross packages delivered onto the islands, but they were for locals only, for the British. The Germans had to go without.
The troops themselves that weren't allowed those rations were really starving. You know, they were trying to catch birds, you know, eating limpets off the beach, anything, you know, seaweed, and some things, you know, even making themselves sick, eating things that really they shouldn't have been eating just to stay alive.
After almost a year of near starvation, the German garrison on Guernsey finally surrendered on May the 9th, 1945. Battery Mirus fell silent, and its colossal guns were sold off for scrap. Today, these eerie concrete symbols of the Third Reich still dominate the Guernsey skyline. A reminder of a time when these islands became one of the most fortified places on Earth.
Looking at these massive concrete fortifications, it reminds us that even tiny corners of Europe that we've barely even heard of were really important to some people and to their lives as they lived through the Second World War.
It's a part of history that's easily forgotten, that part of Britain was occupied. but important to remember.
In southern Finland, on the edge of the Baltic Sea, is what's known locally as the Mysterious Island.
From a distance, it looks like other islands in the region. But when you get closer, you can see there's something different about it.
The island itself has a kind of darkness. Everything's a little bit spooky. You wouldn't necessarily want to find yourself on the island alone.
Mysteriously, ships' compasses don't operate properly here. The beaches are stained black, and the more you look, the stranger things get.
You can spot what looks like bunkers hidden along the shoreline, ruins of old pipelines, piles of broken up rock and concrete. This isn't an ordinary island.
The island itself is also riddled with some ancient history about tales of compasses not working quite correctly.
There have been a whole history of shipwrecks.
The wreckage and debris are not confined to the waters. On land too, there are strange ruins.
All the structures that exist are riddled with bullet holes and signs of explosions. It's like you're walking through a war zone.
What is the problem with this place? Why is it so odd?
The answers to this peculiar puzzle can be found in the early 19th century. By 1809, Finland had been incorporated into the Russian Empire, and this was a strategically vital site. Gisaro Island.
The southern part of Finland is very important to Russia because that is the gate to the capital at St. Petersburg. And so controlling the Gulf of Finland is an absolute defense requirement for Russia.
It sits in such a strategic location in the Baltic Sea. Anybody trying to head to Helsinki or the port of St. Petersburg in Russia has to sail right by that island. That makes it very valuable from a military perspective.
Vital it may have been, but it was also extremely dangerous.
In the glacial periods, it was covered under kilometers of ice. It was pushed down. Since the ice has gone, the area is actually slowly lifting, about 4 millimeters a year.
So you might sail past a place that 50 years ago was free sailing, and now there's a rocky island emerging right in your path.
Under Russian rule, a pilot station was set up here to help ships navigate these precarious waters through to St. Petersburg. But why do the remnants of an extensive complex litter this remote outpost? It was an underground discovery that first interested the Russian state.
It turns out to have been an amazing find because it was the largest undersea iron ore reserve in Finland.
That solved a centuries-old mystery. It's why ships' compasses work so badly here.
Compasses work by being drawn to the magnetic field of the North Pole, but the iron ore in this particular region had its own magnetic field, and compasses were more drawn to that than the North Pole.
In the 1840s, Russian prisoners were sent to the island's mine and forced to excavate the valuable metal ore.
The miners were down there with long metal drills and sledgehammers, banging away, dislodging the rock face bit by bit. And the conditions were so hellish, some of the prisoners reported they would rather be sent to labor camps in Siberia.
By the time Finland declared independence from Russia in 1917, mining on the island had stopped. During the following decades, the young nation's relationship with its communist neighbor was marked by tension and war. In 1939, the infamous Winter War broke out, a conflict that was fought in temperatures as low as -43 Celsius. The better-equipped Finns were able to inflict huge casualties on the Soviet troops, using the deep snow, dense forests, and long hours of darkness to maximum advantage. The war was ended by the signing of the Moscow Peace Treaty in March 1940. And although the Finns were forced to cede territory to the Soviets, the Red Army's reputation was badly damaged. Its poor performance is said to have convinced Hitler to invade Russia the following year. By the 1950s, however, Finland had settled into its uneasy existence between the West and the Soviet Union. In those tense political times, mining at Gisaro began again.
Finland reopened the mines, and now they had modern equipment and they could mine on a much greater, more industrial scale.
When mining started back up again, they had to put in a whole new infrastructure, which included crushing plants, underwater railway lines, pipe networks on land, deep tunnels. I mean, it became a productive mining machine.
Former resident Joran Wickstrom arrived in 1956 as preparations for modern mining operations were getting underway.
The tunnel went straight out from here to the Stone Island. The tunnel went straight out from there, from the shaft above, at a depth of 550 feet. Out there were mining tunnels, in total 1.8 miles of tunnels, all at a depth of nearly 600 feet.
However, mining on the island once again became unsustainable. Global iron prices plummeted, and so did profits. And so, the operation was shut down, and the workers were simply sent packing.
It was at Christmas in 1967 when the final decision was made that everyone was to leave here. It was over, in other words. We just moved out, and then the destruction set in.
But the debris and destruction here is clear to see. Surely the damage was not caused solely by nature and the elements?
After the miners moved out, the Finnish army moved in. The government realized this location was just too strategic to leave unoccupied.
60s, 70s, and 80s, yes, there was a very genuine threat from the Soviet Union.
They were pretty careful to be pretty conciliatory to Russia during much of that period. But a lot of the use of the island was really for training and military exercises. And it was a place where they could fire weapons and drop bombs without any danger of injuring the civilian population, because there was no civilian population.
The Russian invasion never came. In 2002, the armed forces held their final shooting drill, and the island was abandoned once again. Today, the battered site serves as a national park, with half the island open to the public.
It's a smorgasbord of mining and militarization. There's bullet holes everywhere. It's actually seen a lot of action, this small little island in the middle of nowhere.
In eastern England, on the Suffolk coastline, are a string of abandoned buildings, strange mounds, and intriguing pagoda-like structures.
It's incredibly isolated. It's bleak, it's cut off from the mainland by a river, but yet there are these strange mounds and structures on it.
The interiors of the dilapidated buildings are equally mystifying.
Inside the buildings have an abandoned quasi-industrial feel. There are elements of metal and machinery still there, but long disused.
Pretty well all the work that was carried out here was secret, ultimately top secret.
You're still warned to this day that you mustn't tread incorrectly, or you could be blown sky high.
What was the purpose of these battered buildings and strange Asian-style pagodas? And why is this area still filled with danger?
You look at all of these solidly built buildings, and you look at the terrible destruction that's clearly been wreaked on them. You have to ask, what happened to these buildings?
The reasons can be found back in the tense years leading up to the start of World War I. In 1913, the British War Department acquired this large area of land near a small village in Suffolk in order to develop the latest technology in warfare.
This is the corner of England where the experimenters came to find out what happened when you dropped a bomb from a plane. In a lot of ways, this beach is where military aviation started.
In short, the race was on to develop new areas of military science, and this pioneering site was leading the way. It was called Orford Ness.
In World War I, aerial warfare was completely new. People had to invent a new military science. And to start with, it was very crude. It was simply a question of dropping bombs out of windows.
We didn't know what happened to a bomb dropped from a plane until the guys at Orford Ness watched it and measured it with their instruments.
Over the years, Orford Ness established itself as a prime testing site, critical to Britain's air forces. One of its greatest successes was achieved by one of its most illustrious names, Robert Watson-Watt, the brilliant Scottish pioneer in radio direction finding and radar technology. It was at Orford Ness in the late 30s that Watson-Watt carried out his groundbreaking work on radar, the system that served the country so well during the dark days of the Battle of Britain. After World War II, however, a new era of worldwide mistrust and paranoia began.
During the Second World War, the UK and US had collaborated very closely on weapons development. But as the Cold War emerged after 1945, the two parted company fairly spectacularly, and Britain was left alone to develop its own weapons, including nuclear weapons.
The West goes into overdrive in developing nuclear weapons in 1949. This is the height of the Cold War.
Britain was now engaged in a nuclear arms race, and Orford Ness was transformed into the atomic weapons research establishment.
You don't want an atomic bomb to go off between the factory and the airfield. You don't want the atomic bomb to go off on the plane on the way to the target. And you don't want the atomic bomb to go off at the wrong time after you drop it. All of those problems needed to be worked out with experimentation, and that required an experimentation site.
So what experiments took place here? The site's manager, Grant Lahore, explains.
The first test carried out here was on vibration, so they were trying to replicate the vibration in an aircraft or in a lorry on the road, or they were subjecting them to shock or G-forces or humidity or temperature.
Each laboratory was designed to test different components of nuclear bombs.
So this is what was called the hard target, or the high impact facility. And this is essentially where they were rocket-propelling atomic bomb cases, or nuclear bomb cases, into a very hard concrete wall, which was effectively replicating the impact of the weapon when it was dropped.
Yet the two most intriguing facilities are at the farthest point. They are the distinctive pagodas. It's these highly unusual buildings that remain the area's most famous landmarks today.
This looks like an ancient temple. It's got columns holding up a pyramid. It's got arcane markings on the walls, these strange cruciform brackets.
The work carried out here during the Cold War era was shrouded in secrecy.
During that period from the late 50s into the 1960s, the most paranoid period probably of the Cold War, everything really was extremely secret. And it appears as if the site was constantly being monitored and surveyed and photographed by the Soviet Union. And so everything around it was cloaked in secrecy.
The architecture of the buildings is highly unusual, but very specific. They were created explicitly for the purpose of understanding the behavior of weaponry and explosions.
This is a place designed so that if the pillars are blown up, the roof drops down and clamps all of the explosion and debris down into the ground.
The research conducted at Orford Ness remains largely secret to this day. Ironically, it was the success of the site that contributed to its downfall. The US was so impressed by its work, it re-established its old relationship with Britain to help advance both nations' weapons programs.
This facility that concentrates on Britain's separate nuclear development is really no longer needed, because essentially the British will work together with the Americans on nuclear weapons, which is how it works today.
Orford Ness was finally abandoned in 1987. Today, the site is maintained by the British National Trust as a peaceful nature reserve. But its past has left a dangerous legacy.
After so many decades of weapons testing at that site, it's simply not possible to guarantee that all devices have been found.
It is essentially impossible to ever clean it out.
Now they lie abandoned, but once they were at the cutting edge of engineering. There are echoes from history in these decaying structures. They remind us of terror and war, but also of great innovation and human endeavor.